Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly, and voila! You get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I'm your host, David Turetsky. Today with me, I have a very special guest, Sushma Tripathi. Hello, Sushma.
Hello.
Sushma is a Vice President of Strategic Advisory Services with ADP's National Accounts Division. Sushma is an extremely passionate consultant about helping HR by providing thought leadership as well as working with clients actively to help them develop and execute their human resource strategies, human capital management strategies, and also helping them around compliance and execution. Sushma, is there anything you want to add about your background?
No, I think, you pretty much said it. The only thing I'll say is, I've been in the HR world for 25 plus years. So, many times you feel like you've seen it all, but that's never true. You always see new things every day. So I'm big on learning new things on a daily basis.
And with COVID and the way things are in the economy, we couldn't be in a more dynamic time. And so we're going to have fun today about the things that you've learned around how the workforce can react and how do companies react in the world of so much change. One thing that people do not know about Sushma was your love for hiking, which you actually had some time to deal with just recently, right?
Absolutely. So, with COVID, everybody's stuck and you can't go anywhere. We're not flying and doing all our usual things. So what we've been doing is discovering new trails just around the house. So, say like hour and a half drive or something like that. So we've been to several new trails and really having fun with that.
That's a great way of spending your downtime in the world of COVID. So stay safe, though.
Well, thank you.
So today's topic is going to be on new compliance issues and the data that drives business productivity. And I've had a lot of folks who've asked me, what does productivity mean in the HR world? And I think it'll be fascinating to discover what that means in the new world with COVID. So our first question, Sushma, is if we think about the new world of work and the regulations that are there to try and make it easier and more flexible for employers and employees, what challenges do we face in collecting whatever the right data is to meet the compliance and reporting needs and for productivity measurement?
Before we move on, I need to let you know about my friend Mark Pfeffer and his show, People Tech. If you're looking for the latest on product development, marketing, funding, big deals happening in talent acquisition, HR, HCM, that's the show you need to listen to. Go to the Work Defined Network, search up People Tech, Mark Pfeffer. You can find him anywhere.
So, David, let me start by saying that compliance is complicated. And, there are lots and lots of laws. So there are federal laws, state laws, local laws, and then there are new and existing laws and COVID-19 related specific requirements for employers. And when you think about productivity, it really starts with, right after you recruit somebody and when the new hire accepts the job and they're ready to start the job. Even on the first day, when you're onboarding your new employee, you have to consider several factors such as, does your new hire know when they start work? And do they have the equipment to start work? Do they have transparency and flexibility in scheduling? And, do they feel comfortable and are they engaged? And engagement is huge because studies clearly show that highly engaged employees, they are likely to have above average productivity. And then these days, everyone is concerned about employee experience. So, what's the role of HR And also, what's the role of your managers in terms of creating that engagement? And, organization charts these days could be complex. There are lots and lots of cross-functional dynamic teams and possibly contractors working together. And then when you think about your new hire, are you, and also your existing employees, are you offering time for learning and development? And what about training time? And, is there a learning curve? And most importantly, as an employer, do you allocate time for that? So again, you have to correlate all of that. So the bottom line is, how you measure productivity, that is different for each organization based on the business they are in. And then, they're also kind of thinking about how do they measure success and what metrics do they use? And then, just thinking about metrics, where does the data come from and who's responsible for that and who's responsible for productivity? So these are just some of the key questions for employers to consider. In addition to that, if you think about it, there's lots and lots of regulatory requirements that we can certainly, cover. But the big one we are seeing these days is around diversity, inclusion, and pay equity.
Right. And if we think about some of the policies that drive productivity, what are the key considerations that a client or companies need to deal with right now?
So, employers really need to be careful, and they need to develop fair, compassionate policies to maintain, safe and healthy workplace, especially during COVID-19. They need to, train their managers and supervisors, educate employees, think before taking any employment action, specifically termination. They've got to consider the ADA, which is Americans with Disabilities Act, the FMLA, and other options as their employees, are battling through this pandemic. Either it's for themselves or while they're taking care of a family member. And then the most important thing is to remember to avoid that, one size never fits all, right? So we've been in the industry for a while, and that's there. And then also, when you're thinking about productivity, you have to consider everything, time worked as well as time away from work. And when you think about workforce management, which is your time worked, there are lots of laws. So there are wage and hour laws and requirements that come to mind. And that includes your exempt and non-exempt employees, your worker classification. There are different rules for employee versus independent contractors and lots of litigation, especially in California. And then there are other states as well. California is not the most complex state these days. And there are East Coast states as well. And then there are pre and post shift activities. And both of those are compensable for non-exempt employees, even if the manager instructs them clearly not to do so. And then there's off the clock work, that has to still be documented and paid. Overtime pay calculation, that is complex, not just at the federal level, but lots of states and, statutory requirements as well. And then there are meals and rest breaks, predictive scheduling laws, and especially meals and rest breaks. As people are working away from the offices and managers don't have line of sight into what people are doing, all that needs to be documented. And then, like I said, from time away from work, from that perspective, there could be a lot of different leaves that could come into play, including disability, the federal FMLA, the ADA accommodation leave, the state workers' compensation, and then other state and local leave laws. In fact, there are hundreds of those. And then there's the paid sick leave, paid family leave requirements, voting leaves, right? I mean, that's
Absolutely.
the season.
That's next Tuesday.
Yes. Yeah. And then, some of these leaves, they, run concurrently. Others overlap and, they are consecutive, meaning, one comes after the other. So some of these could be paid. Some of these could be unpaid. Some are job protected. And then when you think about just the paid leaves, they are complex because they could be either fully paid or partially paid. And then some can have attendance consequences. So in a nutshell, employers have to provide their employees with the most generous job protected benefit that is most advantageous to the employees. And also employers, need to, in addition to everything that I've said, also be aware of pregnancy disability laws and other anti-discrimination laws. So it's a whole lot to consider.
It's an unbelievable amount of things to consider once you're analyzing or you're looking at where you are in the world of basically absence management and time and being able to help protect your workforce and how they stay safe and healthy. And I guess that brings up another question, and you touched on this a little bit. what are the new requirements that have been put in place because of COVID-19? And, what can employers do? How do they react to those things?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. With COVID-19, we've had several stimulus packages that were passed. So one of the big ones is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and the CARES Act. Those are a couple of
Right.
those that come to mind. Now, basically, the Families First Act, that includes a couple of paid leaves, and those are your Emergency Family and Medical Leave Act expansion, as well as the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. And both of these are federal requirements, and they have tax credit associated with them. And,
Sure.
at the moment, they're supposed to end on December 31st of 2020. But then, we are still in COVID. And as we speak, things are still being evaluated. So obviously,
Sure.
everybody needs to keep an eye out for this and figure out, what's going to happen. And then there are
Right.
lots and lots of IRS, DOL guidance and updates. And since the pandemic started, we've seen a proliferation of state and local paid sick leave laws or even equivalent laws. And then in addition to that, if employers have a collective bargaining agreement, meaning if they have unions, there are other union related requirements in terms of leaves as well. And so at the end of the day, especially for non-exempt employees, when you think about employers' responsibilities, there's a lot of record keeping requirements and the need to, define the employee's work week, their work day, their work schedule, shifts, and obviously pay is associated with that, right? There's shift differentials and other things. And then, there's stipulation around minimum wage and overtime, as well as wage statement requirements, especially for paid sick leave. In fact, we can spend, easily an hour or more just talking about these topics and compliance.
Absolutely. And so I think one of the other things that we probably need to talk about is that all of these things that are compliance related, they cause us to change our behaviors, but it still has impact on the analytics that we're using or the measurements that we're creating or calculating so that we can see what the trends are in how we're spending time, how we're spending our valuable people resources, how we're paying those resources, and how we're allowing them to take time off. And hopefully it doesn't interfere with accruals for vacation and whatnot. And so I think, Sushma, we'll be talking about this in a little bit, but it certainly impacts productivity. And I think we've seen complexities to measuring productivity when it comes to the compliance issues that have cropped up around COVID-19. Of course, there are other things, but measuring productivity has certainly been troubling during the COVID-19 timeframe. And so one of the things that we will be very careful to do is to make sure that we're measuring and keeping in mind those things that have happened during these periods from probably about the beginning of March till hopefully it will end soon, but to when the pandemic starts winding down, which hopefully is soon.
So, David, that's a great point. We all are hoping and praying for that. And when I think about productivity, you talked about productivity a little bit, and obviously we'll cover more on that. But one of the quotes that come to mind is Peter Drucker's, quote, "If you can measure it, you can use it." And I think, the bottom line is that you can't manage what you don't measure. So that is why organizations really need to gather data. They need to track and measure productivity. And especially in this day and age, when a lot of businesses are not making enough margin, productivity management becomes more and more important.
Beautifully said, Sushma.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by Turetsky Consulting and listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
Okay, question 2. How can employers manage productivity, especially during these times in COVID-19?
So that's a great question and $1 million question. So basically, what I'm finding and what I'm suggesting to employers is that they really need to monitor, analyze, and manage absences and overtime. Those are some of the areas where the biggest cost is. And in general, and also specifically with COVID-19, you're going to require some level of analysis and reporting if you're an employer. That could be anywhere from, say, basic overtime and absence reporting, or perhaps, the employer may want to analyze trends and compare themselves to benchmarks, or even be able to start to predict and forecast future costs and performance. Now, you'll be amazed as how technology has been evolving and, what employers can do with that.
So what are the key trends in the technology, and how can the technology provide insight through all of this chaos?
So, some of the key trends are around the use of artificial intelligence, use of robotics and automation. Now, companies are using artificial intelligence to help identify data opportunities. They're using it to improve workflow and also increase productivity. Now, there's also an opportunity to increase efficiency, augment skill shortage. And then there's a huge opportunity to drive insights with data. Now, what I'm seeing is that organizations, they are re-engineering their work sites and how work is done, especially during COVID-19. And as a result, there's new tracking and administrative burden for all the stakeholders. Most importantly, these days, artificial intelligence is basically embedded in HR and workforce management technologies. Now, basically, that improves your employee experience. And when you think about it, the entire employee life cycle from recruitment to offboarding. And it also helps align with production and productivity goals. It can, help increase employee loyalty. So most people in HR, they're just trying to understand the technologies that are being offered and the opportunities on, how they can simplify, automate, and deliver results for their own organization.
Well, so let's stay on the topic of automation, and let's talk about how that really helps the HR practitioner and the person who's actually looking at analytics. So what can you say about automation and how it's going to improve the life of HR?
Well, in general, automation is popular for tasks that are associated with, things like recruitment and onboarding. It can also be helpful for employee training, benefits enrollment. A lot of employers are in the enrollment season right now. Leave requests, workforce scheduling and tracking, and also payroll processing. Now, it works well for submitting and executing your basic transactions. In fact, customer service chatbots, those are common and we all have experienced them. And generally speaking, we all find them useful, but then overuse of poor chatbots, they can pretty much tarnish the employee experience and sometimes even your company brand. Now, chatbots, they can be used to answer basic questions and field some of these tactical requests like, say, how much time do I have left? Right. And then there's the robotic process automation as well. And this is used for file loads, for error reporting, intelligent learning, auto correction, etc. Sure. And, so there's a lot to consider. And the bottom line is that HR bots, they are not going to replace HR. They'll just, help HR increase productivity by assisting with some of these routine, repetitious tasks and, processing related tasks, including those that are associated with general HR functions and HR management. At the end of the day, they'll free up HR resources to work on more strategic initiatives.
So the futurist inside me wanted to react and say, the bots aren't going to take over yet. But as they get smarter and as the data improves to feed the AI and to train the artificial intelligence, I think we actually may see bots taking over, as you say, the simple tasks, but tasks that have been traditionally thought of as being HR only. So maybe soon. But let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the analytics of time and attendance and the context that those analytics can provide in the world of time and attendance transactions.
So, time and attendance data and transactions, they are actually some of the highest volume transactions there are in the HR world.
Absolutely.
So, to proactively compile all of that data, to summarize it, transform it, analyze it, and visualize it for the end users, that can be extremely powerful. And that's what basically analytics can do for any employer or any organization. For example, to be able to see absence and overtime trends across your entire workforce, and more importantly, all your locations, and in general, to have visibility into what's happening in your business, that is very valuable and almost impossible to do manually. Now, when you
Right.
think about it, numbers, data, metrics, information, that's all good. But, sifting through data to answer key questions about people, to help solve some of those people problems, drive success, and understand your workforce, all of that is critical. And, this is where Data Cloud can help. For example, you can understand how your workforce has been impacted by COVID-19. And then, data mashups, they refresh daily and display workforce impact. And then there are storyboards that can help easily identify if the employer is eligible for employee retention tax credit. Now, you can monitor, your employees' sentiment on return to work too, if you have data and if you capture data. So in general, it can truly help practitioners answer critical questions about their workforce, and employers can, take a deep dive into their organization data and benchmark their company against their peers. They can see, workforce and people trends. So in summary, I have to say that, you need this workforce management function and data to be automated in order to make the metrics available and meaningful, so that you can measure productivity and, you can also measure efficiency, quality, and quantity of work that's being done in your organization. And finally, with Data Cloud and data mashups, you can help improve management decision-making by equipping your practitioners with reliable and sound data so that they can make adequate decisions.
So a lot of clients have asked me how to measure productivity. Do you have examples of productivity metrics?
Well, sure. So, in fact, let me start by saying that, it all starts with understanding, how you're capturing data, right? So how you're collecting data, time tracking, employee scheduling, attendance management, leave management, keeping up with compliance, and, how you're conducting the analysis and reporting type of tasks. So those are some things to keep in mind, and so when I think about it, access to real-time data is important to manage productivity and, harness the full potential of your human capital. So, when I talk to employers, employers are in a variety of stages. For example, some of them are in a very tactical stage. They are just running reports and trying to get work done. And some of them are more in an operational stage, or, some are even more advanced and they're using more strategic tools to be proactive and possibly even predictive and prescriptive. And so, when I think about technology and productivity management, it all depends on what the client has, right? So are their processes automated? Do they have data governance? Do they have accurate and clean data? Are the employees using self-service and capturing data? So I think, all of those things sort of come to mind. And when I think about time worked and time away from work data, that can help you see trends for a variety of things. And one of the examples I gave before was absences and overtime.
Sure.
So, it all depends on, are you able to match your labor supply with forecasted demands? Do you have visibility into potential workforce shortages and overages? Because, both can be detrimental to your business. It can be expensive. And also, do you have flexibility and convenience? Can your employees enter and approve time anywhere, anytime? And so these are some of the things that come to mind. But I think your question was more around, productivity metrics.
So one of the things that I think about when I talk about productivity metrics is what's the industry that people are in. If you're in healthcare, for example, nursing, we talk about the number of beds serviced. If you're talking about hospitality, we talk about the number of rooms. If we talk about manufacturing, we talk about the number of pieces. And in the technology world, where things aren't as transactional, we talk about the number of hours spent, because if someone's developing software, we're typically working on a particular problem. And so it's how many hours did you spend on that problem? So when you're looking at standard operating procedures for each of those individual things, there are timeframes that you're supposed to meet in order to be able to achieve, whether it's servicing a patient and taking their blood pressure, taking their vitals and writing it into the notes, or if you're someone who cleans a room, how long does it take you to clean the room? And if you're someone who is a manufacturer, how long does it take you to actually complete your task for the product? And so each of those have a measurement, and then we can measure how much that person at that point in time spent on that task. So it's very easy to be able to measure productivity. Whereas with a developer, as a contrast, you probably have time in the Agile world in a sprint to be able to complete a task. But in the world of Agile, we know that if the problem is too big and we have undersized it, it needs to leak into the next iteration. So there are different ways of determining productivity, right? And it kind of depends on the job and the industry.
So David, I fully agree with you. And I think in general, it depends on the organization. Like you said, what's your line of business and what type of business are you in? And, you gave examples of work, but then there's the time off related productivity loss as well. And so along those lines, if you capture all that data, it can clearly show you what your opportunities are to optimize that productivity. And then, most importantly, these days, especially when I'm consulting with employers, a lot of them are looking for or looking to distinguish between productive versus non-productive time. And that is hard to get to unless you have adequate data.
And in those cases, you are, as you mentioned before, about relying on employees with employee self-service to code the productive versus non-productive time. It becomes impossible to try and discern that unless you have their cooperation.
Absolutely. And when you think about it, most of these solutions, that is why these days, they provide some type of a dashboard, and, some even provide insights and possibly even, highlight situations that need attention. Specifically, if there's a spike in a certain area or certain location or certain department, and, managers could get mobile alerts and all of that around that. So again, that is why these tools are really helpful to make sure you can analyze that data and visualize it to take that appropriate management action in order to, enhance productivity and profitability, and most importantly, employee engagement for your organization.
So Sushma, we've talked about three fascinating topics around the world of productivity in the time of COVID-19. One, which is how do we react and be flexible in a world where we have more regulation than we normally had. Then we talked about how can employers manage productivity in the world of COVID-19, reacting to all of those compliance issues. And the third was, how can we talk about, or what are good examples of metrics? And you mentioned a few. So I guess the question is, anything else you wanted to talk about, any other issues or anything you wanted to bring up before we close?
No, actually, you've pretty much summed it all. So in closing, I'd like to say that, workforce data is not an abstract concept. A few years ago, it used to be, but not anymore. It's basically your employees' data, and all employees are creating a constant flow of data every day, every minute, specifically as you think from a productivity perspective, as they produce your goods and services for your organization. And you can use this data to discover, also to interpret and communicate meaningful pattern that you see. And then most importantly, you can use that data pattern to make effective decisions. So hopefully, that sums it from my perspective.
Yeah, and the one thing I wanted to say in reaction to that is that there's a ton of data here. As you mentioned, this is the number one source of data for an HR management system. And the time data has a ton of phenomenal insights in it. It just needs to be parsed correctly and interpreted correctly. And the one thing I would say is that we need to be very careful when we're looking at this to be able to make the right assumptions about the data as we're looking at it. As we mentioned, the regulations are forcing how we act, and then these data systems like the time management systems collect data about what we're seeing, what's actually happening in practice. So be careful as you're looking at this not to try and overinterpret the data. I've mentioned this a few times. The art of interpreting this data is an art, and we shouldn't look at it as a science. And there's a lot of stuff here and a lot of good things that we can interpret to see patterns that are bad and things that we might need to correct. And then there are patterns here that we might want to encourage and look at other places for other opportunities. You mentioned great metrics like overtime and absence rates and leave rates. And those are things that we definitely need to manage and be careful of, especially in the world of COVID-19. And encourage managers to make the right decisions around flexibility and allowing people to be healthier mentally as well as physically during this time. Okay, so I'd like to thank my guest, Sushma Tripathi. It's always wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much for listening. Please provide us with feedback. And if you like the show, please subscribe and tell your friends about it. Thank you very much. Take care and have a wonderful day and stay safe.
That was HR Data Labs. Please visit turetskyconsulting.com/podcast to review the show, add comments about this episode, or add new ideas about upcoming shows you'd like to hear. Feel free to be creative, but please be nice. Thank you for joining us this week on the HR Data Labs podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.